Back in the 1990s, when Marvel Comics hadn't become the juggernaut, no pun intended, that it is today following the Disney sale in 2009, and the splitting of their film and television rights for certain characters such as Spider-Man's rights going to Sony, the Hulk and Namor's rights going to Universal, and the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Daredevil rights going to Fox, Marvel had what some might consider a more niche precursor to the Titan that is the MCU, and that was the Marvel Animated Universe. In the 90s, following the more lighthearted shows such as Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, or the classic Fantastic Four cartoon, the one where they defeated Magneto through the power of gaslighting, and other more wacky and wild antics, the Marvel Animated Universe was born in October of 1992 with X-Men the Animated Series, which was recently revived with the X-Men 97 Disney Plus series that I'll be looking into at a later date. And it contains series such as X-Men, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Avengers United They Stand, and the show that I'll be talking about in this series, Spider-Man the Animated Series. And, depending on who you ask, its loosely tied in sequel, Spider-Man Unlimited. For the purpose of these videos, I'll be referring to Spider-Man the Animated Series as either Spider-Man or Spider-Man 94. Spider-Man was the show out of all of these that I watched the most growing up. I had DVDs, I had a few of the toys, and there were several times when my dad would find episodes online for me to be able to watch more of the show as I was growing up. The brilliance of the Marvel Animated Universe was that while most cartoons were made solely in this time for the purpose of selling toys and advertising, and had a status quo to get back to at the end of each episode, so that there were no big changes to the continuity, the Marvel Animated Universe trusted its viewers to stick with full-blown story arcs that would span several episodes, or in some cases, full seasons before there was a full payoff to the story. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not stupid. Spider-Man 94 and the rest of the MAU were completely made to sell toys. I mean, look at some of these things. You're telling me that the giant spider slayers and all the different colorful Spider-Man villains weren't made to sell toys? Of course they were. But that being said, there was a lot more to follow than just a villain of the week plot most of the time. Spider-Man was written by John Semper Jr. with various other writers assisting it, and was directed by Bob Richardson, originally airing on the Fox Kids Saturday morning cartoon block, before later airing reruns on Disney XD, which was how I consumed a lot of the series early on in my life. Spanning 5 seasons and 65 episodes, it's considered one of the greatest animated comic book adaptations of all time, and it was even the first introduction of the Spider-Verse concept before even the comics did it. The series followed several of the comics very closely, likely helped by the fact that Stan Lee is listed as executive producer of the show, alongside Avi Arad, who we know has never once interfered in a Spider-Man project or greenlit a Spider-Man project in just an effort to make himself more money, only for it to flop, and certainly has never once patted himself on the back in the credits of a Spider-Man project. But he's not what we're talking about today. Today, I want to begin my retrospective episode by episode, arc by arc, season by season, as I revisit the Marvel Animated Universe, seeing some of it for the first time and taking you through the years of Marvel's first big interconnected universe that they created outside of the comics. So let's begin with Season 1, Episode 1, The Night of the Lizard. If you want to watch me watch through this episode and hear my thoughts on it as I watch through, you can check out my Patreon listed down below. Straight out of the gate, we have to talk about that intro. The opening sequence, the guitar, the lyrics, the animation, it's all just so smooth. And part of why it's so smooth is that the theme song for this show is performed by Aerosmith guitarist Joe Perry. No joke. The theme song itself never changed throughout the 65 episode run of the show, and I honestly think it's up there as one of the hardest cartoon intros of all time. The episode starts, as most of them do in this show, with a staple of the Spider-Man character, where Spider-Man, voiced by Christopher Daniel Barnes, known best for his many recurring roles in Spider-Man as Peter Parker and other characters, and also for being Prince Eric in the Little Mermaid animated series from Disney, narrates his early adventures. We go straight down into the sewers, where a former TV executive is now working as a sewer worker alongside this guy who looks a little bit like Bob Hoskins in the original Super Mario Bros. Movie from the early 90s. Maybe I'll have to do a retrospective of that masterpiece someday. But either way, in the sewers we get our first introduction to the lizard with glowing red eyes, but we only get a brief look at his arm, his eyes, and just little bits of him. I love these little teasers we get for the first introductions of villains before we get to see them fully revealed later on. The two sewer workers are chased off by the lizard before they climb the ladder and get in their van, and the one that looks a lot like Mario gets yanked back down in the sewers by the lizard, while the former TV executive goes speeding off, weaving in and out of traffic, nearly causing several accidents. This causes Spider-Man to swing into action and try and make the save. The worker is talking about glowing red eyes, and Spider-Man treats him like it's nothing but a joke, while swinging him back to safety. One thing I really want to address is the beautiful animations that play during swinging in this show. This is because, rather than being entirely two-dimensional, there's also experiments of early 3D animation done in this show for a lot of the backgrounds, specifically when Peter is swinging around the city. We then take a hard cut to the next day at the Daily Bugle, where Robbie Robertson, voiced by Rodney Salisbury, is talking about the lizard, and Peter still thinks it's some kind of joke, only for J. Jonah Jameson, voiced by the late great Ed Asner, to come power walking in. And this, of course, is before Jonah was synonymous with the actor J.K. Simmons, thanks to the Sam Raimi trilogy, and more recent years of animation that followed, where J.K. Simmons has played the character in most, if not all, animated adaptations, and live-action versions of JJ as well. Jonah offers Peter a $1,000 reward for good photos of the lizard, which immediately introduces Eddie Brock, voiced by Hank Azaria, who you may know best as Moe, or comic book guy from The Simpsons. He's also rocking a flat top. Now, can anybody that was around in the 90s actually tell me, were flat tops just really popular back then, or is this one of those weird character design choices? I know Stan Lee had a lot of influence in the design of the characters in this show, which is why Peter Parker is rocking what I believe Stan himself described once as a hip modern hairstyle that looks like it came right out of the 70s. Now that being said, I've always had a really soft spot for this Peter Parker design and this Spider-Man design, so I give it a slide. With a $1,000 reward on the line, the race was on between Peter and Eddie for who was going to get the first photos of the lizard. After debating to himself that night at home what he should spend the $1,000 reward on when he gets it, talking to himself about possibly getting a new motorcycle or even putting a down payment down on a car, remember when $1,000 was a good down payment for a car? We get introduced to this series version of Aunt May. I know a lot of people prefer younger versions of Aunt May that we've gotten depicted in the recent years, with things like Tom Holland's Spider-Man movies with Marissa Tomei, or even the Marvel Spider-Man video game on PS4 and PS5, but I do really like the dynamic, as well as seeing May being an aunt. It makes us assume that she's around the same age as Peter's parents would be. But this Peter also is college age, so assuming that Peter is, let's go with around 19 in this show, since he seems to be new to being Spider-Man, mentioned earlier by the fact that he says he still has to figure out how to take photos while being Spider-Man.
When am I going to get the hang of being a superhero and a photographer at the same time?
And the fact that he is now in college, and we hear him talking about driving, so we know he's over the age of 16 while he's talking about cars, and with being in college, we know he's not new to college, so he's got to be somewhere around that sophomore, junior year of ESU. All of that being said, that would mean that if his parents had him, let's say, in their late 20s, early 30s, that would mean that if May is around his parents' age or just a little bit older than his parents, this would put her around the mid to late 50s, maybe early 60s. Meaning the design of her in this show is fairly accurate, maybe just a little bit too old, but then again, I could just be completely wrong about all of it. And it probably doesn't even matter at this point. Aunt May is first voiced by Linda Gary, who voiced Shadow Weaver in the original She-Ra series. That reference is just in there for my wife. Then in the last two seasons by Julie Bennett. Both actresses are sadly no longer with us today. Aunt May is revealed to be severely behind on her bills and hides this from Peter, who finds the bills and realizes that he feels like he's being selfish and should use the reward money to help her, since she's taken care of him like a mother for so long. I love this detail, because even though it's really not selfish for Peter to use the money he's going to earn for putting his life on the line for something other than himself, it shows that he's quite the opposite and is completely selfless, and that he will use the money to help people in need before he's willing to do something nice for himself. With that new info of what he's trying to earn the money for, Peter heads off to his college, Empire State University, to analyze the pictures he got of the lizard's footprints in the sewers below when he encounters Deborah Whitman, a recurring friend and academic rival for Peter throughout the series, voiced by Liz Georges. He immediately describes her as the annoying little sister he never asked for, making her one of the only female characters his age in the show that Peter doesn't pursue a relationship with at any point romantically. Eddie Brock sneaks along into ESU behind the two, and they all hear a crash coming from Dr. Kirk Connors, Peter's main professor's office, where the two go in and find the lizard inside the office, where he takes off and Peter is in a hot pursuit. Only, after striking this pose on the windowsill, it's gotta make you really think, how did nobody else figure out his identity? Peter takes off after the lizard, believing that he kidnapped Dr. Connors, and Eddie Brock, who can apparently match the speed of a running lizard and Spider-Man swinging, is not too far behind, following the group all the way back to the doorstep of Dr. Connors. During a fight between Spider-Man and the Lizard, Connor's family, made up of his wife Margaret and his son Billy, revealed that the Lizard is none other than Dr. Connors himself. Connors had used his research into neogenics, a completely fictional field of study made up for this show, and using the direct definition from this show's wiki, according to Kurt Connors, neogenics is the study of genetic exploration and manipulation of DNA. And it was also the most important discovery of that century. Neogenics was created by Dr. Farley Stillwell while he worked for Empire State University. Not to be confused with the real-world neogenics with an X at the end, which is related heavily to stem cell treatments, which if you're a wrestling fan like I am, you've probably heard a lot about it. But in a flashback sequence, we see that Peter and Kurt were experimenting on a 3-pod mouse named Mickey. Ironic seeing as who owns this show now. Disney probably never would have let something like that through nowadays in their newer series like Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. Seeing how protective they are over that mascot, hashtag bring back Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, you cowards! And we see that by using reptile DNA, specifically that of a lizard, since lizards can regrow their tails after losing them, Mickey was able to regrow a lost paw. When Peter left, Kurt attempted to use this on himself to restore his lost arm. Oh, by the way, Dr. Connors is missing an arm. This is a pretty natural thing across Spider-Man lore. Didn't really feel like it was all that important to mention it here. Kurt was able to regrow his arm back and went straight home, only to then begin mutating into a giant human lizard. In all of the chaos of Eddie Brock finally showing up and taking pictures of the whole thing, planning to out Connors as the lizard to get the reward money, it distracts Spider-Man long enough to swing off into action, hanging Eddie up by his shoulder with a webbing to a lamppost, telling him it will dissolve in a few hours, and destroying his camera. But in that 30-second window, Lizard shows back up and takes Margaret Connors away, so Peter takes Billy to a neighbor's house, and then goes off to plunder the sewers looking for the Lizard. So, when Peter heads off into the sewers to look for the Lizard, he finds the subway repairman, the one that looks like Bob Hoskins from earlier, and helps save him. Peter finds the Lizard as he's planning to use his neogenic recombinator device to turn his wife into a lizard, under the idea that it would heal any wound. It's important to mention here that in this continuity, and many others, the Lizard mutation also warps the mind of Dr. Connors, feeding into the mutation's wants. So, it's not like Dr. Connors in the Amazing Spider-Man movies with Andrew Garfield, where there were the memes that people were making around the time of No Way Home about Connors wanting to turn everyone into lizards himself, even when he himself wasn't a lizard. Because if you think about it, that's a really big plot hole there in that movie. He wasn't about to die like all of the other villains were. He just wanted to turn everyone into lizards and thought it was the way forward. Anyways, Spider-Man swings in and throws a few kicks and web strikes at the Lizard. Another side thing I want to note here is that a lot of people like to joke that this is the strongest adaptation of Peter Parker because he beats all of his villains without throwing a single punch. This is reportedly due to how strict censorship was over these cartoons at the time, so Spider-Man was rarely allowed to throw punches. In fact, starting now, in this retrospective, I'm going to keep a counter from here on out through the entire 65-episode run, and we'll see just how many punches he threw by the end of it. It'll be fun. Peter puts Lizard down after the two go tumbling deep into the water with the genetic recombinator. By the way, Spider-Man can apparently just hold his breath underwater because this fight is going on for a long time, and this is far from the only time in the series where he is going to be spending almost a full minute or longer underwater without coming up for air. But during their tussle underwater, Spider-Man reactivates the genetic recombinator and turns Kurt back into himself, getting him and his wife back home, and of course managing to grab his camera that he webbed up at the start of the fight to get a few pictures, true Spider-Man fashion there. Gotta respect the hustle, he wants to make that money. He makes sure he gets the payday without exposing his mentor's identity or airing his dirty laundry. When Peter gets Connors back to his house, we cut to the next day, where Eddie Brock is trying to convince the cops and J. Jonah Jameson that Connors is the Lizard, offering to eat a copy of the Daily Bugle if he's wrong, which, when the group are greeted at the door by a one-armed, completely human Kurt Connors holding his son, leads to this incredible exchange.
You want it cooked or raw?
So Peter gives the reward money to Aunt May, who asks how he got the pictures of Spider-Man, to then immediately accuse Peter of just plundering the sewers by himself and bringing home a bunch of germs and telling him to go wash up because he's probably a petri dish, which is hilarious. And like most episodes of the show will, ends with Peter recapping his adventure and talking to himself about why he can't tell someone that he's Spider-Man, or how little they truly know while swinging off into the night. Roll credits. Overall, this feels like a great introductory episode to the character and the series for anyone that isn't familiar with Spider-Man going into it, especially kids of the 90s who wouldn't have been as big into Spider-Man comics at the time, perhaps. When I was a kid, I actually never saw this episode because it wasn't on any of my DVDs and it scarcely aired on Disney XD, at least not when I was recording it. So the first time I actually saw this episode was in 2019 on Disney Plus when it first launched. So this is only the second, maybe third time I've gotten to see this episode. The things I absolutely love about this show are that the pacing never feels like it's dawdling around in the episode, and so much of the animation still looks really nice even with the knowledge of how old the episode is. I think some of the pacing definitely has to do with the fact they're only working within a TV time frame, so they can't waste too much time on filler. But even then, it feels like there's a nice balance of comedy, action, and dialogue going down where it still doesn't feel like it treats its audience like kids at any point in the show. The art direction is just really nice, and the shading on scenes like the lizard, where he's mostly dark shaded with just a few pops of color here and there, it's just beautiful. As an artist married to another artist, I think I know a thing or two about good design. And the music in this show is just another thing that is absolutely incredible. It always matches the tone super well. The orchestral background music was written by Shuki Levy and Haim Saban, and it was conducted by Udi Harpaz. And it still holds up beautifully with the tone of this show. Oftentimes, when I'm writing my own comics or reading Spider-Man, or admittedly even writing some of what, for lack of better terms, would be considered fan fiction I have for characters that my wife and I have created, which maybe I'll talk about someday with those characters and their universe we've created. It's interesting enough to me, and there might be some interest from the internet at some point. But anyways, this is always the music I picture in my head for setting scenes. Here's some interesting trivia about this episode as well before we wrap up that comes straight from the fandom wiki for this show. Go check out that site for things I might not mention here and show some love to the authors. So, to begin, John Semper Jr. actually originally wanted the first villain of the show to be Venom. However, someone working at the TV network actually suggested to Semper that he build up slowly to Venom and save the big guns for later in the season, which is why Semper decided to choose the Lizard for the first villain. The past Noticeville in Peter and Aunt May's house is actually signed by Lawrence Kim. Lawrence Kim was one of the background designers for this show. When Spider-Man's crawling through sewers, he mentions the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the Defenders, and the Hulk. Spider-Man mentioning Defenders also brings up an interesting continuity error within the series. In the comics, founding members of the Defenders are Doctor Strange, Hulk, and the Submariner, and later the Silver Surfer. However, Spider-Man is going to meet Doctor Strange later on in the show in a self-titled episode, Doctor Strange, in Season 3, when Spider-Man doesn't know who Doctor Strange is. This can of course be explained away by saying Strange is a hermit and kept out of the public eye like he did in the comics, but still, he's part of the Defenders. Fox Kids aired this episode about 4 months before the other seasons as a teaser for the rest of the show, and the reason this episode aired months before the rest is because Avi Arad pressured John Semper to finish the episode so he could use it to advertise the Spider-Man toy line from his company, Toy Biz, so that the toys would sell before Christmas. Of course he did. Syndicated versions of this episode omit the shot where Lizard accidentally slams his tail into his wife when turning, and this episode is loosely based on Amazing Spider-Man number 6 from 1963. 2 years before this episode aired, the pilot episode of X-Men the Animated Series aired, and its first episode also had a very similar title, Night of the Sentinels. It's unknown if these two episodes were having similar names for intentional reasons, or if it was just a happy coincidence. This episode also marks the first time that Kurt Connor's true comic book name is used outside of the comics. In the 1967 Spider-Man animated series, his name was Kurt Connors, and in the 1981 Spider-Man cartoon, the Lizard's human form of Kurt Connors is never seen or mentioned. In the opening scene when he's saving the driver from the wrecking car, Spider-Man asks the subway worker if the red eyes he saw belonged to pink elephants. This could be a reference to the pink elephants from Disney's 1941 movie Dumbo. The term seeing pink elephants is also a euphemism for drunken hallucinations, which is probably more what it was referencing. Spider-Man probably thought the reason the man was driving so recklessly was because he was drunk. Another Disney reference is of course made with the lab rat Mickey that we talked about earlier, and in this episode, Peter's spider sense gives him green eyes. This is the only time in the show that this happens. Stan Lee was also worried that Mary Jane was not in the pilot episode because he felt that Mary Jane had to be the only woman in Peter's life in the series. However, John Semper Jr. felt that if Peter was not torn between two or more women, then it wasn't the Peter Parker everyone had grown up with in the comics. As soon as Stan Lee saw how things were playing out in the series, all of his fears were put to rest, and according to John Semper, Stan Lee was behind him 100%. This episode features the only time Peter wears a baseball cap at any point, and it's when he's walking to ESU in the rain. It says ESU on it. The door to Dr. Connor's office has his name on it, but his last name is incorrectly spelled Connors with an E instead of an O at the end. And this next part is actually just me. I'm officially done reading off of the wiki at this point. I mentioned earlier that when Spider-Man is crawling through the sewers, he mentions the Avengers and the Defenders. It really makes you wonder what the lineup of the Avengers is at this point in the Marvel Animated Universe. Iron Man is seen as a bit more of a mystery and a loner due to having his own animated series, and when he does eventually show up in Spider-Man the Animated Series, not many people know who he is. I don't believe there's any mention of Thor at any point in Spider-Man the Animated Series, and this show later on shows what the fate of Captain America is, so we know he's not leading the group. It makes you wonder if the Avengers in this animated world have any of the big three on them, or if they're just a completely different lineup. Eventually, I plan to take a look at the Avengers animated series in this universe, so I might have my question answered then. I also think it's interesting that this is an early mention of the Defenders before they become the street-level heroes that they're known for being nowadays, with the likes of Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Jessica Jones, and Daredevil. As I mentioned earlier, it seems to be reference to the original comic book versions, where it's made up of Hulk, the Submariner, Doctor Strange, and sometimes the Silver Surfer. Of course, as I said, we'll be seeing Doctor Strange in later episodes of this show, and the Silver Surfer has his own animated series, as does the Hulk. So it's not too far out of the realm of possibilities that this is, of course, the referencing lineup Spider-Man was talking about, but who knows for sure. I don't believe the Defenders ever get referenced again in the Marvel Animated Universe. But overall, that's a wrap on this first episode of the Retrospective. From here on out, I'm going to be going episode by episode, unless it's a multi-part saga, so next time I'll be looking at 2 episodes back-to-back. Season 1, Episodes 2 and 3, The Spider Slayer and Return of the Spider Slayers. Tell me, what do you think? What memories do you have of this show? Have you seen it before? Maybe I was able to convince you to check it out if you haven't. Tell me all that and more down below in the comments, and until next time everybody, I've been Xander, that was Spider-Man 1994, and next time, maybe I'll be a little less beat by beat of the show, and I'll go a little more into the fun facts underneath.